Hello viewers, my name is James Westover. I am a student from Pittsburgh State University. This video is part of the GRT 850 class that is done over the internet. Um, I am happy today to present on something that I'm very passionate about, which is firearms and kind of just a little bit about everything in regards to them. A little bit of background on me. I participate in competitive shooting with or at least I used to, with the Scholastic Clay Target program, and I have done a tremendous amount of volunteer work for the USA Clay Target League out here in Idaho, and I hope that that this presentation can at least have some impact for good on the future. And diving right into the first topic of firearms and their function and so on would be the materials used in construction. Now, materials that have been used have kind of stayed the same, but the metallurgy has changed dramatically as technology is advanced. I mean, in some of firearms technology's infancy, I mean, they were using bronze barrels. I mean, yeah, it just didn't last very long and were rather hazardous. Nowadays, you see these very high sophisticated carbon steels that would be used in the barrels, the bolts, the firing mechanisms. Stainless steel is also another one that's used a lot because it's so corrosion resistant. Of course, every steel has its strengths and weaknesses, and in a lot of cases, you want a high carbon count so that it's strong and it will endure well, but it'll also corrode. Um, Woods are another very common material to be used in firearm production as they'll basically hold the barrel. I mean, it's the thing that you hold up to your arm. In other cases, in ultra lightweight firearms, you can get composites or high strength polymers. Um, and for extremely high performing firearms, you'll run into things like titanium or carbon fiber. Aluminum is another one that's also readily used, especially in the receivers on modern guns, as it's a lot lighter than steel and it can handle the abuse that a receiver needs take, and it does a very good job at it. In the background here, I figured I'd include a pretty neat image. There's a picture of a barrel being machined. It's actually having its riflings drilled right now or put in place, carved in, and that's kind of how that process would go at a gunsmith or guns manufacturing plant. The physics behind and working principles of firearms is very simple. Essentially, the chemical energy that is generated by the igniting of the powder that is used um, in a case or that has been put down the barrel in the case of a muzzleloader uh, is then ignited and is used to propel the projectile down the barrel at a very, very high rate of speed and then to its target. Um, and that principle has remained the same since the beginning of firearms. With the development of added technologies and the need for higher performance out of many guns, uh, you'll be using kinetic energy to cycle the bolt. This is something that you can see in this picture I've included in this slide, where the energy from the round being fired is actually used to cycle the action rearward as well as shoot the projectile forward. And there's a very delicate balance there with a lot of fine tuning and springs and all sorts of things. And you can see this in semi-automatics. You can see this in fully automatic firearms. It's across the board. There's a lot of fine tuning that goes into it. Here's a prime example of a modern semi-automatic firearm. This uses the direct impingement technology, and the semi-automatic direct impingement technology works by bleeding hot expanding propellant gas from the barrel through a port, through a tube, which you can see here just above the barrel in this picture on the right-hand side of the slide, to the firearm's bolt carrier group. That gas pressure is then used to push an internal bolt carrier backward. It will rotate and unlock the bolt, which will eject the spent casing, and it will then chamber a fresh round as the bolt carrier group moves forward. Here in this slide, we can see a semi-automatic inertia-driven system featured in a shotgun. Um, These actions have been around for many years. They've had issues with reliability up until recently, but they've proven themselves and have been used in military and civilian applications across the world. The current cost of firearm production varies wildly across the board. Um, it, these costs are largely contingent upon, you know, what purpose does a firearm serve? Is it mass produced? Does this have to have very certain specifications and tolerances, like in the case of this firearm here on the bench with the gentleman from Accuracy International actually manufacturing a sniper rifle that has to have an extremely tight grouping um, for military purposes or for police purposes, where this is now you're protecting people and you have to hit your target in a civilian area. You can't afford to miss. I mean, in the case of that, you have to have hours of perfection put into it, and science and technology and development, and firearms like that are not cheap. In the case in which it's a mass-produced model that you see at the shelf, like a Glock, it's a run-of-the-mill Glock that you'd find, a little pistol, with a polymer-based handle, you're gonna run into about 30% or 50% of the cost of the firearm on the shelf is actually the cost it took to produce it. So if your gun was retailing for about $330, it probably only took $70 to $50 to actually produce it. Um, and again, returning back to that Glock as an example, I mean, those cost more, but the raw materials are around 90 to 110. Um, Now, metal framed and custom firearms, kind of like this Accuracy International, they have higher costs um, because there's a lot of CNC machining that goes into it, and the human element must be perfect to achieve the tight tolerances that I had mentioned previously. Um, and then, of course, whenever you go to buy any of them, there's always the distributor markups, and that runs to about 17 to 21%. And the social impact of firearms throughout time and across the globe, and especially in the United States, has been mixed. I mean, when you look at the genesis of a firearm, its sole purpose was to take life. And in the case of which it can also be used to provide for your family, in terms of hunting. It's also used to defend your property and to defend your rights, like we as American citizens, especially in 1776. Um, Firearms are very deeply rooted in the foundation of the United States of America, and it's clearly seen with patriotism. People do indeed like their guns, and I think it's important to look at the social impact of firearms from both perspectives in terms of, you know, cost to the nation, cost to the person, all of that. And it's not fair to just have one outlook on what guns have done and can do, and what's the cost of gun ownership at the end of the day. Now, the pro-gun perspective says that that firearms are a vital component of personal security. They deter crime. They keep the government from overreaching and stepping on our personal rights. They also say that it's for self-defense and for security. Uh, a lot of people do have concealed carry permits, especially where I live in Idaho. I swear, I think everybody's carrying a gun, and they believe that it deters violent crime and so on and so forth. I mean, at least here, there's a lot of people carrying, and there's a lot less crime here than there are in places like Chicago. But you also run into things like there's a lot less people. Um, they also, the pro-gun perspective also banks on constitutional rights, and it's one of the inalienable rights necessary for maintaining freedom and preventing tyranny, which I completely and totally agree with. Um, and one of the other things that the pro-gun perspective has is that they can actually be community building. As I had mentioned, I had participated in the USA Clay Target League, and it's brought people together, going out and shooting clay targets out of the air and teaching kids about firearm safety. And it's a positive way to keep kids taught and involved. And believe it or not, the USA Clay Target League, or any kind of clay target shooting sport that is high school based, is actually found to be one of the safest sports you can participate in the nation, which is truly remarkable. Now, the anti-gun perspective. There is a huge public health concern and violence concern and mass shootings and fear and economics and the social class. And that's all very truly horrible. I think the problem that you get is there's just too many guns in this country to even begin to control or regulate exactly who has them. The best thing we can do is, kind of what we're doing now. Of course, you could always increase the strictness of some of these policies in terms of how quickly it takes to get a firearm, and how thorough are the background checks. To a degree, they should be a little bit more thorough, I think. But the firearm, especially when you encounter things like very small, concealable firearms that have a very high magazine capacity, they can inflict a lot of damage in a public environment. And do we really need that? Is that really part of sporting? Is that really part of defending our country? I mean, with that being said, I gotta say, we have the ability to obtain pretty much whatever we want. It just, in terms of firearms at least, it just depends on how much you're willing to spend. I mean, if you want to get a machine gun and you want to have the equivalent to whatever the armed forces is carrying now, it does cost a lot, but you can get it. But the route to getting that isn't as easy as walking in and buying a gallon of milk at the grocery store, and thank goodness for that. There is a need to have that be regulated. I am glad that some of the most recent laws have actually, taken away the tax stamp for some of these things, but it's it's good that, you know, things are being checked, people are being looked over. There's people who are sick aren't getting them. The big proponent is that you have these people that go and buy these guns, and maybe they might not be sick, but then they don't take care of their stuff. They don't lock it up, or their house gets broken into. And now somebody who is sick now has a gun. That's a problem. At what point can we start checking in on things like that and having some kind of better regulation over it? I think it's important that we look into actually expounding on that, but not while also infringing on rights. And that's a very delicate path to walk on. For that for that sake, I'm kind of grateful I'm not in politics regarding the matter. Um, I mean, there were mass shootings, I think, in Las Vegas not that long ago that was done with it was still legal at the time. It was a modified um, Armalite rifle that was capable of firing really quickly, not necessarily as a fully automatic firearm, but when somebody who's sick has something like that and just wants to cause mass hysteria, they're gonna do it. I think it's also important to note that guns in and of themselves, I don't think that they cause crime. I mean, you're gonna find crime even in the states with the strictest gun laws, right? Whether it's done with a gun, a knife, an axe, or even a claw hammer, as they're responsible for a great deal of murders in this country, you'll still find crime. And I think it's important to maybe consider that as a factor that, we as a people need to change and we need to improve, and people need to be taught uh, as well. When it comes to the evolution of firearms throughout the years, it's important to focus on these five basic categories here, where you have ignition, cartridge, revolving action, semi, and fully automatic actions, as well as precision. In the early days of firearms, they were all muzzle loaded and were often lit with a match or a flint or a percussion cap that were all kept on the outside of the barrel and fed spark into the barrel, which would then light the powder and send the projectile flying down the barrel. Um, Now, when it comes down to the ignition part of that, the biggest evolution that happened was the primer or the percussion cap or variations of it throughout the ages. It allowed for reliable ignition. That was something that all firearms struggled with. It was far easier to have that be stored. You didn't have to deal with wet powder or anything like that. And once that was mated with the technology of a cartridge, essentially, where you kept the bullet and powder all and primer all cased in one nice little brass package that you could store and reload rapidly, is when firearms really took off. People got to be creative with new action types like revolvers from the cowboy days, in the West, and lever actions as well, um, from Henry or from Marlin that you've seen. And then the biggest leap after that would have to be these battle rifles, which our armed forces have used, and these really took off actually in the Second World War with things like the M1 Garand and the M1 Carbine, and these guns really proved to be effective in combat, defending, our nation. Uh, Following that, we've had developments in precision. Um, Precision is not something that you can just have. You have to really, really focus when it comes to obtaining that in a firearm. It requires a very accurate level of machining, far beyond anything that older technologies could achieve. And when you have CNC machining involved, you can really have some high performance firearms. Now, as far as suggested improvements for firearms, there's room for growth and improvement on anything in life. And in some cases you kind of think to yourself, is there a need to make a firearm more lethal? Well, I don't know. I'll leave that decision up to the military. They can research that and they can figure that out. As part as in regards to civilian markets, I think there's definitely a need and an importance to have some kind of technology out there that would make it so that if a kid somehow, out of, I don't know, sheer neglect, even out of sheer neglect, if a child were to obtain a firearm that was not put up, whether he's at a friend's house or he's in his own house, that he should not be able to discharge it. And one thought that I've had is kind of, is similar to the keyless start systems or keyless entry systems on your automobile. Like maybe for those who have a pistol and are very particular about having it be an everyday carry item and want to be the only one shooting it, you could have some type of chip, which you also have in your car key, implanted in your hand or on your wrist, which has to be within proximity to your pistol to actually allow the pistol to have its trigger be pulled and be fired. Um, I know that the scientific hurdles and technological hurdles to get there would be immense, but I mean, I've seen some pretty wicked things. My cousin is actually working with the development of something like a fingerprint reading gun, which is probably a better design. But personally, I think that you're going to have accuracy issues. In the case of somebody who works with their hands, right, who's a blue collared individual where their hands are constantly getting covered in dirt or constantly getting scuffed up, those fingerprint reading technologies have really failed to be accurate and function reliably for those people. And in the case in which it could be a chip that is used on your hand or on the hand of whoever else you want to use it, um, you could actually maybe have a safer gun, right? That way you need to have the chip and the gun, both have them fire. Not only that, you also have to have bullets in it. So if you stored them somewhere else, then you'd have like three variables that would all have to line up, and you could save lives. And I think that's an important thing to explore when it comes to firearm ownership in this country. The other thing I would like to have explored is weight reduction research. In some cases, having a heavy firearm is necessary, right? Because if you're shooting a large projectile, it's a simple science, right? If you shoot a large projectile and there's a ton of energy going downrange, that an equal amount of energy is going to be felt going backwards. Um, or at least Newton's laws uh, pertain to firearms as well. And a lot of them, if they're semi-automatic, are absorbed in the action. But if you have a bolt action, you're going to feel it a lot more. If you have a lever action, you're going to feel it a lot more, right? Because the bolt doesn't move after you've fired a shot in those cases. And so you get a very, very, very heavy impact on the shoulder. So unless the gun is heavy, uh, you're going to be hurting. So recoil mitigation is a good one. Another technology I think that would be important to look at is bullet sectional density. Now, this is probably a topic that might be a little too in depth, but I love it. I love talking about this. Sectional density is remarkable. And in World War II, we used howitzers with big round shells. I mean, they were not very long and they were kind of very thick, and they had issues penetrating armor, and that was because of the shape of the projectile. Um, Something called sectional density. The greater the sectional density a projectile has, the greater it's going to be, or the better it's going to be as a penetrator against armored anything, armored vehicles, armored vests. I mean, whatever the case may be. So that could be something for the military to look into. I know that I think that was actually something they are trying to aim for. I'm not sure with this, more recent gun that they're looking at developing or are developing for the new rifle for the nation, which you'll see in the next slide um, as a current version. But anyway, I probably shouldn't divert. The other, and lastly, the thing that I want to cover here is education. People people need to be taught gun safety. This is something that used to be in school curriculum that I personally believe should still be there. I mean, good grief, we have the Scholastic Clay Target program. I have that in places like Phoenix, Arizona, and it goes across the nation. It's very important to have firearm safety. There's just so many guns in this country. The rising generation needs to know about the dangers. They need to know about the risks. They need to know about how capable those things are, and how devastating they can be when used incorrectly. So that I know that's not necessarily a direct improvement to the technology, but I think that's a improvement to the user, and we should consider it as well. With all that being said.
One of the most prominent disadvantages that modern firearms face is weight. This is something that all firearm manufacturers have been battling since the dawn of time. Um, as the gun becomes more complex and the more parts and the more attachments and the more features you put on there, the heavier the firearm is going to get. And especially given the fact that you're going to be driving up the cost. Every gun is already expensive by today's standards. Um, Having more attachments on it not only makes it harder to carry, it makes it far more expensive. The other major thing that modern firearms deal with as a disadvantage would be the ammunition type. There really isn't a universal. You go into the store and there are shelf upon shelf upon shelf of different ammunition, and it all has its own purpose, and it's all like a specialized tool. But at least when it comes to combat and a standard issue battle rifle, uh, nobody can decide. The East has a different cartridge from the West, and now we're currently exploring a new round with this XM7 battle rifle. Figured I'd include a picture of it, as that's the one that's currently undergoing some rigorous testing for our armed forces. Um, and with that being said, if you have a bigger cartridge, you also have limited ammunition capacity, and that will also create more weight as you have to carry more rounds.